video, we're going to talk about shortages and surpluses. And these are two examples of when a market is out of equilibrium. As you might remember, equilibrium is that circumstance where we're at a specific price that balances or makes equal the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. So I have a sample diagram for each of these two occasions, and both of them are going to start with a market in equilibrium. So just to recap, when we look at the intersection of the demand and the supply curves, there's one spot or location where they cross, and at that point, this price, which I'll label P star, is my equilibrium price. At that price, the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are exactly the same. I've labeled that point as Q star, and I'll do that on my diagram here as well. Here's P star, and here's Q star. Now, if the market price is not at equilibrium, then we'll see that the market is thrown out of equilibrium and will generate either a shortage or a surplus. We'll start with an example of a shortage. We wind up in this situation if the market price is somehow below equilibrium. So I'm just going to label that here. I'll call that PS for shortage. And what I'm going to do is I can see that this is not the intersection of the demand and supply curves. So I'm going to see what happens at the price of PS in terms of my quantity supplied, which is at this position. And if I take that price and extend it over to the demand curve, my quantity demanded is at this position. What I see is that quantity supplied and quantity demanded are no longer the same. So my market is not in equilibrium. And in fact, the market is not in equilibrium in a particular way. It's in a particular circumstance where the quantity demanded, in this case, exceeds the quantity supplied. So let's go over here and summarize some of that information. What we've got here in the case of a shortage is a market price, P, that's below the equilibrium price, P star. That creates a situation where the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. Now, conceptually, what's going on here is as that price falls, consumers are following the law of demand and increasing their quantity demanded, while producers are following the law of supply and decreasing their quantity supplied. That pulls the market apart and gives us these two different quantities. Now, sometimes we phrase this larger quantity demanded in excess of the quantity supplied as excess demand, which is a good description. But perhaps more familiarly, we'll describe it as a shortage. And I'm going to show you the shortage on the diagram. It's just this horizontal distance between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. Now, the market is going to try to get back to equilibrium. And so let's talk about how that would happen. Now, taking things aside from diagrams and vocabulary and economics as a subject, let's just think about what happens in the real world if something is in short supply or there's not enough of it to meet the consumer demand. What we have with a shortage is more buyers who want to purchase something than sellers willing to offer that product for sale. The quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. If you're a buyer in that market and you really want that product, you might be willing to pay a little bit extra in order to purchase it. And what happens there is we see a little bit of upward pressure on the price. Likewise, if you're a seller who has one of these relatively scarce items for sale, you might realize it's a classic seller's market. I can increase the price that I charge and still find a buyer because buyers are kind of disadvantaged in this situation. And what we see is as the price rises, it decreases the quantity demanded as some buyers will decide, I was willing to pay PS for it, but I'm not willing to pay P star. So we move to a lower quantity demanded. But as that price rises, we'll see more sellers motivated to enter this market because while it might not have been worthwhile at a price of PS, it will be worthwhile at a price of P star. So let's summarize that to fix. There'll be some market pressure for the price to rise. price rises, the law of demand tells us the quantity demanded falls, and the quantity supplied will rise. That'll get us out of the situation where there's excess demand, and if the market fully returns to equilibrium, we'll be back at P star, Q star. So there's a shortage. Now, alternatively, we could wind up in a situation where we have a market surplus. That's going to be exactly the opposite of what we see with a market shortage. In this case, what's going to drive the surplus is, again, a wrong price, but it's going to be a price that's too high. So we'll also call this price PS for surplus. And what we see again is our starting reference point at P star, the market's in equilibrium. Quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. The number of items consumers want to buy is exactly matched by the number of items producers are willing to offer for sale. At a price of PS, that's no longer going to be true. So I'm going to take my surplus price and see where does it hit or intersect my demand curve at this point. So I'm going to label that QD. And where does this price hit my supply curve? All the way over here, which I'll label QS. So right away we can see the market's no longer in equilibrium. We have a gap between quantity supplied and quantity demanded. Okay, so let's summarize what's going on here. The reason we're in this situation, or we're out of equilibrium, is because the market price is too high, or specifically, P is above P star. Now when that happens, we see in our diagram, the outcome is that the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. That higher price has signaled some consumers to drop out of the market or wait to buy. They're no longer interested in buying if they have to pay the price of PS, but it's also motivated some producers or sellers to come into the market. So things are out of balance. Since our supply exceeds our demand, we might refer to this as an excess supply, or in more familiar terms, we might describe this as a market surplus. And I'm going to show you that surplus on the graph. It's the horizontal distance between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. It represents the extra items for sale for which there are no buyers. Now again, markets are trying to get back to equilibrium. So when a market sees this situation, it wants to resolve it. So we can talk about how the market will return to equilibrium, but before, again, we get stuck in the language or vocabulary of economics and diagrams, let's just think about how this might apply in the real world. Anytime there's an excess amount of anything for sale, there's pressure on the sellers to lower the price. Now that may be voluntarily because they want to move the merchandise and clear the way for new items, or it might be driven by buyers who notice the high inventory and might think that it's a good time to negotiate for a discount. We can turn excess supply around and say, well, there's kind of a lack of customers. If you're one of those customers, it's a classic buyer's market. So what we tend to see is producers might want to lower the price, putting pressure downward on that price. As that happens, some sellers might decide it's not worth it to sell. It was okay at PS, but if I have to charge a lower price, this isn't a good business for me. At the same time that that price is falling, some consumers may decide, I actually do want this product, or it's within my price range or budget. As I couldn't afford it, or I didn't want to pay that much when the price was PS, but I might want to pay that price at P star. So we may see eventually the market will get to equilibrium. So to fix, there's market pressure for the price to fall. And as that price falls, we'd expect to see the quantity demanded rise following the law of demand, and the quantity supplied to fall following the law of supply. That eliminates this gap between supply and demand, or between quantity supplied and quantity demanded, and returns us to equilibrium.